This is the Blue Hole of Santa Rosa, a seemingly ordinary pond nestled in the heart of New Mexico's desert, yet beneath its tranquil surface lies a dark and sinister secret. After the tragic deaths of two amateur divers in 1976, a metal grate was installed to seal off the entrance to this mysterious underwater cavern. But despite all the warnings, two divers reopened the cave 37 years later and ventured inside. This, unsurprisingly, would prove to be the worst decision of their lives. These are the final moments of the Santa Rosa diving disaster. About 100 miles east of Albuquerque, New Mexico, lies the small city of Santa Rosa. On its outskirts, there's a swimming spot that, at first glance, appears to be just a simple pond. However, first impressions can be quite deceiving. In New Mexico, this blue hole has been a popular tourist attraction for centuries. In fact, legend has it that the infamous outlaw, Billy the Kid, would often take a dip at this swimming hole before heading into Santa Rosa. But despite its modest size and appearance, this location ranks among the top diving sites in the United States. The Blue Hole of Santa Rosa is a natural artesian well, a type of spring fed by deep underground water. The water is under such pressure that it flows at an incredible rate. In fact, this spring pumps out a constant 3,000 gallons per minute, enough to fill an entire water tower in just over an hour. The water in the Blue Hole completely refreshes itself approximately every 6 hours, giving you an idea of its size. However, this hole isn't large, at least by Blue Hole standards. The surface measures about 80 feet across, but as you descend, it narrows before widening again near the bottom. At its deepest point, around 80 feet, the hole spans nearly 130 feet in width, and if you make it down to the bottom of the Blue Hole, you'll find some intriguing objects. Along with the expected boulders and rubble, there are also bones, a crucifix, and a small, ominous opening on the eastern side. This tiny 4-foot-wide opening, now sealed with a metal grate, leads to a vast underwater cavern. From the outside, there's no way to know what the cave's interior looks like until you venture inside. While most people have little interest in exploring the inside of a cave, some are drawn to the excitement of challenge and exploration. Unfortunately, the grate that now covers the entrance wasn't always there. In March of 1976, a group of 10 students, along with their instructor, arrived at the visitor center, eager to explore the Blue Hole. These students from the University of Oklahoma were there to conduct an underwater photography project as part of their coursework, and by mid-morning, they had all suited up in their scuba gear, ready to dive into the clear waters. Among them were two students, Mike Godard and David Gregg, who entered the water alongside the rest of the group. But before the dive commenced, the instructor laid down two strict rules. Don't linger at the bottom for too long, and, most importantly, don't enter the cave on the eastern side of the hole. With these warnings fresh in their minds, the students began their descent, eager to explore. However, for a few of them, especially Mike and David, the cautionary words seemed more like a challenge or tempting dare. As they explored the depths, they soon found themselves face to face with the small cave entrance at the bottom. Their curiosity piqued. They exchanged a knowing look, silently agreeing to take a risk and see what was hidden beyond the cave's entrance. As Mike and David ventured into the cave, they immediately noticed a change in their surroundings. The cave descended sharply, dropping about 15 feet straight down. Unsurprisingly, the environment here was vastly different from the clear, open water above. The space became tighter and tighter, with jagged, sandy walls and a murky atmosphere. There was a stark contrast to the crystal-clear waters they had just left behind. Despite these changes, they continued down the passageway. Once Mike and David reached the bottom of the descent, the cave split into a large corridor that branched off in two directions at a steep angle. Behind them, the cave formed a dead end, but ahead, the tunnel seemed to stretch further, splitting into multiple rooms. These corridors, though wide enough to navigate, presented a hidden danger. Without careful maneuvering, divers can easily disturb the water, kicking up sand and silt from the cave floor. The problem is that it's easy to overlook how much sediment you're stirring up while focused on the exploration. It's only when you turn around that you realize the once clear path has vanished into a swirling cloud of debris. Unaware of the trouble they were in, Mike and David pressed on, unknowingly sealing their fate. When they finally decided to turn back, they found themselves disorientated, surrounded by a thick cloud of silt. With no clear direction and the tunnel winding unpredictably, they quickly lost their sense of orientation. In such situations, extreme panic often takes hold. Hyperventilation begins and movements become frantic, only worsening visibility and causing collisions with the cave walls. Next comes the terrifying moment when you realize your air supply is nearly empty and every breath feels restricted, as if you're trying to breathe through a straw. Back on the surface, their instructor soon realized that something had gone wrong. Mike and David were nowhere in sight. There was only one place they could have gone. It wasn't long before a recovery operation was underway. That same afternoon, rescue divers arrived at the cave's entrance, using a 100-foot guideline to navigate the murky passages. Unlike Mike and David, the rescue divers had the advantage of this line to ensure they could find their way back, even in a complete silt-out. During their search, they discovered Mike's body near the entrance to one of the cave's branching rooms. Finding David, however, would prove far more difficult. The depth was a significant challenge, but beyond that, the narrow passages were so confining that only one diver could navigate them at a time, making the search even more dangerous. Over the following days, the search team managed to reach depths of 181 feet, more than twice the depth where the cave begins. During the operation, one diver reached the end of a long corridor and used a powerful flashlight to illuminate the space. However, the chamber was so vast that the light barely penetrated the darkness, leaving the bottom out of sight. One of the most unnerving aspects of the search was the dislodging of rocks from the cave ceiling, caused by the diver's bubbles. In one instance, a diver was struck on the back by a rock roughly a foot wide. In another case, a diver narrowly escaped being hit by a 2-foot-wide boulder weighing hundreds of pounds as it tumbled through the dark, narrow passageways. After 4 grueling days, the search was halted due to the water becoming too cloudy, a result of changing pressure on the surface. Following this tragedy, the city quickly sealed the entrance with a heavy 300-pound metal grate to prevent further access. However, this barrier would be short-lived. It wasn't until 6 weeks later, when the grate was temporarily removed, that David's body was finally found. Surprisingly, he was discovered at a depth of just 130 feet, much shallower than where the rescue efforts had ventured. Once David's body was recovered, the grate was reinstalled, where it would remain in place for nearly 40 years. 37 years later, the ADM Exploration Foundation, a well-known diving organization, reached out to the city of Santa Rosa. They requested permission to explore and map the cave, which had been sealed off for decades. Unfortunately, the ADM was granted access. Their first task was to remove the heavy metal grates that had covered the cave's entrance for so long. However, upon removing the grate, they were met with an unexpected challenge. A massive amount of rock and debris blocked the entrance. Unbeknownst to the city, the military had dumped 2 truckloads of rock over the entrance years before. The team had no choice but to dredge the bottom and clear out the debris before they could even think about entering the cave. Finally, in 2016, the passage was cleared enough for the exploration to begin. The mission was led by legendary cave diver Mike Young, with seasoned Navy diver Shane Thompson boasting 20 years of experience and a team of other elite divers by his side. For a few days, they meticulously mapped the cave and placed fixed lines to ensure a safe path in and out, and by March 26th, they had reached a depth of 195 feet, the farthest they could go. Although it was possible to go deeper, the team realized it would require significant additional effort to clear more rocks blocking the path. They chose to wrap up their exploration at that point, with Mike planning one final dive to ensure no passages were overlooked and to retrieve the line he had secured at the bottom. Little did he know, one final dive would take on a whole new meaning. It's unclear whether the cave had always been this treacherous or if conditions had worsened over time, but by the time Mike and Shane went in, the passage was filled with massive rocks and boulders, starting around 140 feet deep. These obstacles turned the tunnels into a maze where they had to carefully navigate through narrow cracks and gaps between enormous, unstable boulders, some as large as cars. The conditions were so tight that there were moments when they couldn't even turn around. At times, they had to remove smaller rocks to continue, which was risky because dislodging one could shift a much larger boulder above them. On this fateful day, Shane decided he would join Mike on the final dive to reach a pre-planned depth. As the two divers passed through the first narrow opening, they found themselves in a tunnel littered with rocks and debris, with only a few feet of clearance between the bottom and the ceiling. The tunnel was about 6 feet wide, which, given their depth in the cave, provided decent space and visibility. Eventually, they reached another tight restriction. Mike signaled Shane to stop and wait. This was the point where Shane was supposed to stay behind, while Mike, the more experienced diver, ventured into the next section alone. The upcoming passage was extremely narrow, making it safer for only one person to proceed. After giving the signal, Mike turned and squeezed through a small crack between the boulders, disappearing from Shane's view. As he moved forward, the cave became even more treacherous, with tight spaces between massive boulders that forced Mike to pull himself through using only his arms. He reached the line without any issues and was about to remove it when he decided that the moment should be filmed. Since they were also documenting their exploration of the blue hole, Shane had been carrying a camera, so Mike thought it would be a good idea to go back and retrieve it. As expected, when Mike turned back, the passage was completely clouded with silt. The space was so confined that it was nearly impossible to avoid brushing against the rocks and kicking up sand. Despite the poor visibility, Mike wasn't too concerned since he was following a guideline. However, after swimming just a few feet back through the restriction, he unexpectedly collided with something. It was Shane. The two divers were now face to face, stuck in a tight squeeze. A few minutes before, as Mike's fins disappeared from view, Shane made a split-second decision to follow him, completely disregarding their plan. Driven by a sudden urge to explore the rest of the cave, he squeezed through the narrow openings after Mike. By the time they unexpectedly collided, Shane had already forced his way through 5 tight restrictions. He was beginning to feel trapped, and the first signs of panic were setting in. The realization that Shane had followed him into such a precarious situation added to Mike's confusion. After a brief moment of shock, Mike signaled Shane to turn back, but Shane quickly admitted he couldn't. Wedged in the narrow space with little room to maneuver, Shane was stuck. Realizing there was no easy way out, Mike carefully backed up through the narrow opening, reached for Shane, and pulled with all his strength. The effort to free Shane was intense, and Mike feared he might injure Shane's legs in the process. Nonetheless, he managed to drag Shane through, and they both began the difficult journey back toward the exit. Though the thick silt clouded their vision, Mike could feel the guideline moving in his hands, reassuring him that Shane was still following. Then, suddenly, the line was yanked out of Mike's grasp, as if Shane had pulled on it with force. In an instant, Mike was plunged into darkness, completely cut off from his only lifeline. Desperately, he began patting the surrounding rocks, trying to relocate the line, knowing it was his only way out. As the seconds ticked by, Mike could feel his breathing growing faster, but in a moment of clarity, he realized that there was no need to panic. He had time, so he forced himself to calm down, taking deep breaths to regain his composure. Once he felt more composed, Mike started searching again. He had a rough idea of the direction he needed to go, based on where he had been heading before losing the line. After some careful exploration, he felt a small opening in the rock and decided to go through it. As he continued to feel his way around, he miraculously stumbled upon the guideline once more. A wave of relief washed over him as he took a deep breath and resumed following the line through the boulders. Suddenly, out of nowhere, Mike felt Shane's arm reaching through a tiny gap in the boulders. The frantic movement made it clear that Shane was in a full-blown panic. Mike quickly grabbed onto Shane's arm to offer some reassurance, all while desperately searching for a way to free him from his tight spot. After a tense moment, Mike spotted a slightly larger opening nearby. He pulled Shane toward it, trying to guide him through. Shane, still overwhelmed by panic, seemed to recognize that Mike had found an escape route. But as soon as Shane reached the opening, he began scrambling as fast as he could, not thinking clearly in his fear. In his frantic effort, he wedged himself underneath Mike in the narrow tunnel, with their heads now at opposite ends. They were now both stuck, with Shane still in a state of extreme panic. He kicked his fins wildly, forcing Mike to shield his face from the blows. In the chaos, one of Shane's kicks struck a valve on Mike's suit, breaking it and causing cold water to start flooding in. Mike knew they were in a dire situation and that they needed to get out fast. He managed to wedge one of his legs into a crack, creating just enough space for Shane to wriggle through. But the struggle wasn't without cost. Shane ripped off one of Mike's fins in the process. The force of their sudden freedom also pushed Mike forward, sending him through the opening Shane had just emerged from. Once they were free, Mike paused to gather his thoughts and calm his nerves, which proved difficult given everything that had just happened. After a brief moment, he felt steady enough to continue. He exited the small opening and started feeling around for a way up and out. As he did this, he miraculously found his lost fin lying on some rocks. The discovery felt like a lifeline, almost as if it symbolized that there was still hope of making it out alive. Mike took it as a good sign and resumed his search for the exit. He moved cautiously, finding one small hole after another, navigating through each. Eventually, he reached an area where the silt had settled, and he finally had some visibility. As he swam towards the clearer water, he spotted the guideline. Relief washed over him as he grabbed it, and to his surprise, he felt it moving. Shane was still somewhere ahead, trying to find his way out. Without hesitation, Mike turned and began swimming toward where he believed Shane was, determined to help him make it out of the cave. However, as Mike continued swimming, the line suddenly went slack. In that instant, he knew that Shane had passed away, or at least fainted. And so, with a heavy heart, Mike pushed forward and soon came across Shane's lifeless body. Mike couldn't take his time to process what just happened. His suit was partially filled with freezing water, and he still had a lengthy decompression process ahead before he could safely exit the water. He would have to leave Shane behind for now. Reluctantly, Mike made the difficult decision to follow the line back through the maze of corridors and tight passages until he finally reached the safety divers waiting just above the cave entrance. Once there, Mike managed to communicate the devastating news. Shane wasn't coming back. He then began his grueling 2-hour decompression. The earlier panic, combined with the cold water flooding his suit and the sorrow of losing Shane, made it an excruciating couple of hours. After finally surfacing, Mike took time to warm up and gather his thoughts before recounting the events to the police. It was during this conversation that he realized the weight of the situation. He was the only one capable of retrieving Shane's body, meaning he would have to return to the cave. Despite his exhaustion, Mike was prepared to go back that very night, but the rest of the team insisted that he wait until morning. After Shane's body was recovered, the team reviewed the camera footage to piece together what had happened. The video revealed that Shane had followed Mike almost immediately after Mike disappeared from view at the second restriction. It also became clear that Shane's intense breathing had overwhelmed the rebreather system he was using. Forced to switch to his emergency gas, he burned through it rapidly, and in his panicked state, he never reverted to his main system. Further examination of Shane's body showed that his suit was badly torn, with rips all over from his frantic attempts to push through the boulders. In the end, although the team successfully mapped the cave, it was far from the outcome they had hoped for. Today, the cave entrance has been sealed off once again. If you made it this far, consider subscribing for more interesting stories detailing the final moments of the most horrific tragedies. Thanks again for watching, and I will see you in the next one.